So for the last couple of months, I've been teaching Tehillim on Monday nights, and there's so much that we could learn from Tehillim. I did a whole shiur on the Mizmor of Hayinu Kecholmim, imagining what the end of the Gola looks like. Very, very important. But for Tish'a BeAb, I think there is no Mizmor Tehillim that's more relevant to Tish'a BeAb than Al Naharot Bavel. So I want to just go through a little bit of kind of reading the Pisukim together, getting an understanding of what's happening, and how we could relate kind of one consistent message through the two parts of the Mizmor. And I'm going to read through it quickly, and then we'll go through it. I do want to identify two specific points where the Mizmor breaks off. So Al Naharot Bavel, Sham Yashavnu, Gam Bachinu Bezochrenu Et Zion. It's not a difficult Mizmor to translate. On the rivers of Bavel, on the rivers of Babylon, to quote the American song, there we sat and cried as we remembered Zion. Al Aravim Betocha. Aravim is Arve Nachal, the willows of the river. I don't know what a poplar is, but I know what a willow is, and I know that I carry Arve Nachal every year on Sukkot. Talinu kinorotenu. There we hung our harps. We'll get to that shortly. Kisham. Why? Why did we hang our harps by the willows on the rivers of Babylon? Kisham she'elunu shovenu. Our captors made a request of us. Divrei shir. They wanted us to sing songs. What songs? Our songs. What are our songs? The songs of the Bet HaMikdash. V'tolelenu simcha. And they wanted us to be like jesters for them. Sing your songs, those beautiful songs, the songs of the Jews. We like them. But they were doing it for their pleasure at the expense of our suffering and mourning. Shiru lanu shir mishir Zion. Sing us a song from Jerusalem. Ech nashir et shir Adonai. But that's impossible. How could we sing a song of God? Al admat nechar. Im eshkachech Yerushalayim. Should I forget you, O Jerusalem? Tishkach yemini. May my right hand be forgotten. Tidbak leshoni lehiki. May my tongue, out of dryness, stick to the palate above it. Imlo ezkerechi. If I fail to remember you. Imlo a'ale et Yerushalayim al rosh simchati. If I don't recall Yerushalayim at the top of all of my joys. I'm going to stop there, and we'll get to those other Pesukim, Zachar Adonai Livnei Edom, in a moment. Let's go through this Mizmor one by one and see what's going on here. So Pasuk number 1 says, Al Naharot Bavel. The very first question that anybody has to ask themselves when they read Mizmor 137 is the question of who is the author of this Mizmor? So one thing that's notably missing here, that's present in so much of Sefer Tehillim, is that opening attribution of Le David, right? It doesn't say Le David or Mizmor Le David or Kina Le David. It doesn't say anyone's name. So it's difficult to tell if Le David means attributed to David, meaning written by David, or Le David meaning for David. And there's reason to assume both in different settings. But here we don't have anyone's name. So could it be that this wasn't written by David? Could it be that it wasn't written in David's generation? Could it be that it was written by someone who actually sat Al Naharot Bavel on the rivers of Babylon hundreds of years after David passes? And so there are two approaches to this. A very worthwhile approach to consider is that of the Septuagint. The Septuagint was a translation of Tanakh that was ordered by King Talmai of Egypt in the in a period prior to the writing of the Mishnah, and is granted a lot of validity in rabbinic literature. And here I have a translation of the Septuagint into English that tells me, for David of Jeremiah. I don't read Greek, but this is the original Greek of the Septuagint per this website. Le David, meaning in honor of David, but not written by David. Who is the song written by? Jeremiah. Who would Jeremiah be? The prophet Yirmiyahu. So I have one approach that says this actually wasn't written in the time of David HaMelech, and it wasn't written by David HaMelech, but it was actually an account of the exile itself by the most famous chronicler of the exile, Yirmiyahu. And according to Chazal, at least 4 chapters of the 5 of Megillat Echa are attributed to Yirmiyahu. So it would make sense that this text, which really goes hand in hand with the book of Echa, would have been written by Yirmiyahu. That's one approach. Another approach that I had, and here, there you go. Another approach, which is from Midrash, asks the question, Al Naharot Bavel Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu Bezochrenu Et Zion. On the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and cried as we recalled Zion. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav Melamed Sheher'a HaKadosh Baruch Hu LeDavid Churban Bait Rishon VeChurban Bait Sheni. That this song really is attributed to David. It really was written by David. And it was a nevuah, it was a prophecy that the Bait that was not yet built in the times of David would one day be destroyed. And the Bait that would replace it will too be destroyed. Bait Rishon, after all, it says, Al Naharot Bavel. Who destroyed the first Bet HaMikdash, if not Bavel? Bait Sheni, you have Edom. And Edom, according to the rabbinic tradition, what the genealogical descendants of Edom was the Roman Empire. And since the Roman Empire was responsible for the destruction of the second Bet HaMikdash, it's clear that whoever wrote 137 had a prophecy of the future, because it was asking for the vengeance of Edom. And therefore, once I accept that 137 is a prophecy, then it need not have been written by Yirmiyahu. It could have been written by David himself. And that's the standard rabbinic tradition, that 137 was written by David. And it's a prophecy of a Churban that will come. Of course, that adds meaning to the Kinor, because who was most famous for carrying a harp, if not David? So there we sat and we cried as we remembered Zion. Al Aravim Betocha. What is an Arava? An Arava is a willow. In the English language, river willows are sometimes referred to as weeping willows. Why would they be called weeping willows? As it turns out, there are certain willow trees that when the wind passes through their leaves, the sound is a whistle, it's a hum, it's a... And when you have a choir of willow trees, with the wind sweeping by them, it would sound a lot like what the Jewish people sounded like on their encampment on the rivers of Bavel. A collective cry. So the Aravim Betocha is not just an image of me hanging something because I won't be using it again, but rather it's describing what I sounded like when I wrote this, what the people around me sounded like when we wrote this. Like weeping willows. We cried, but the trees that gave us shade cried too. They cried for us. They set the tone for how we cried. But there's also a transition here. You could argue that the sound that the willow makes is musical. It's a choir. That's how I just described it. Well, no longer will I be conducting my choir. No longer will the choir of God be in Yerushalayim. No longer will I need my kinor, my harp, my lyre for my choir. I'm not going to be singing anymore. So the aravim, the willows, actually become the sorry substitute for our cries, for our songs, rather. And so there I will hang my harp. Now there's something else that a harp does in the wind. A harp is a big instrument with very long strings. A lyre, a kinor, would have been a smaller version of the harp, but it would do the same thing. And Talmud in Masechet Berachot says that David, when he needed to wake himself up in the middle of the night, he did the following thing. He took his harp and he placed it by the window. Because at a certain hour of the night, the wind would pass in a certain direction, directly through the strings of his harp. And the wind alone would cause the strings to vibrate and hum. And so by hanging my harp, I'm doing two things. One, I'm saying I won't use this anymore. And two, it's saying I can no longer sing the songs of God. But you, the willows who sing, you can. And so I'm giving you my harp. And just as the wind passes through the willow branches and creates a humming sound, the wind will also continue to play the song of God. And so the rivers of Babylon, according to Pasuk Bet, symbolize two things. One, it's a place where I could finally rest from my exile and I could finally cry. So you can imagine that if I'm marching, if my Babylonian captors are forcing me to march and I am to stay alive, I cannot cry. I must be in survival mode. So Al Naharot Bavel, the rivers of Babylon, firstly represent my opportunity to take rest. This is the first time as I march away from Yerushalayim and up to Bavel that they let me take rest, take drink. I've reached my destination, and so my captor lets me rest. Now I can cry for the first time. I cry. The willows that give me shade cry. And now my harp, which I can no longer use, is going to cry along with me because I hung it on the tree for the wind to blow through it. And it cries too. What are we crying for? Two things. One is Ech Nashir et Shir Adonai al Admat Nechar. One of the things that I had in my land was the right to sing for God. I can no longer sing anymore. So the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, But if you wish those things which keep the Mikdash alive when it's destroyed, our prayers, our songs, I have to sing them here in order to survive. But then it hits me. It's so unnatural. It's so wrong. This isn't how things were meant to be. The song of Adonai was not meant to be sung here. It was meant to be sung on God's land, in God's Mikdash. And now I have no choice but to sing it here. And the other piece of why I'm crying is because what was for me a tefillah, what was for me holiness, a way to evoke God, is for them entertainment. They want me to sing it not out of tefillah. They want me to sing it so that they can sit back and appreciate the Jews' music. And there I can't help but to think of the imagery of the Nazis who forced talented Jewish singers to sing for them for their own entertainment. And that's the heartbreak that's being described here. And so there I summarize the first half of Tehillim 137. But then there's a radical shift that takes place. Every single pasuk between 1 and 4 was in plural. Yashavnu, bachinu, bezochrenu, talinu. Ech nashir, how do we sing? If you look at pasuk 5 onwards, it's im eshkachech Yerushalayim, tidbak leshoni, im lo a'ale. It's no longer the collective singing, but the individual. And what is he saying? He's saying, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand be forgotten. He's essentially threatening himself. He's promising himself that he will never forget. And that if he should come to forget, that he should be punished for having forgotten. His tongue should dry out. And I ask the question, these people here who are crying, what are they crying over? They're crying over Yerushalayim. If I am acutely in distress, if I am crying over something that I just lost, am I going to say to myself, oh, I hope I don't forget, I hope I don't forget? How could I forget something that's so painfully close to my heart? I don't need to threaten myself to forget if I'm in acute mourning. If I'm sitting together under the same tree with the people who are mourning with me. They share my memories and I share theirs. They share my grief and I share theirs. Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, I would argue, takes place decades, if not centuries later. It's no longer the we together, but the I. The we has transplanted itself in Bavel, has moved on, has built homes, built families, had reason to celebrate. And in that reason that it's had to celebrate, that's where it became afraid what if I forget? What if I get too comfortable here? If I forget, then I want my right hand to be forgotten. I've been doing this. My left hand to be mirrored. Tidbak leshoni lehiki im lo ezkerechi. May my tongue dryly stick to my mouth if I don't remember you at the height of my simcha. Again, I would argue that these people here, they're not thinking about simchot. They're hanging their harps. They don't actually believe they'll ever be happy again. It's so foreign to them, it's so far away to them that they could be happy on this land. It's not possible to be happy, to have simcha on the land of a foreigner who has exiled us and forced us into captivity. And so the person who's saying this is actually able to celebrate because they've done the inevitable, which is they've had to live despite their exile. And in life we marry, and in life we bear children, and when we do so we experience joy. But he tells himself, you cannot forget. So I have 5 more minutes. I do just want to go through these last 2 Pesukim, and then I want to look at elsewhere in Tanakh that might validate the authorship of this Mizmor. Bat Bavel Hasheduda. Ashrei sheyeshalem lach et gemulech. You who have held me captive, I pray that you suffer in the way that you made me suffer. I pray that your babies have the same fate as what you did to my babies. You smashed my babies' heads against rocks. I pray that the nation that captors you, that exiles you, does the same to you. And I suspect what's happening here is they've grown comfortable in Bavel. They've accepted life. They've opened up businesses. They're trading in the marketplace. The Babylonians at this point are not so evil on the day-to-day. At the end of the day, we live in their land. We pay taxes to their government. They're our neighbors. They're our business. They're our customers. And we are their customers. We have no choice but to interact with them. Well, after a few years, you may invite one to the wedding of your daughter. Who knows? And so these last Pesukim are a way of saying, I'm not going to forget that you who's being nice to me today because you need me, that when I was a child exiled from Jerusalem, my siblings died because you smashed them against rocks. And that's a collective memory that I will punish myself if I forget. And so it's clear that that's what's happening in this Mizmor. We tend in Galut to forget, to become comfortable, to experience joy so that we forget what we've suffered, and then we lose sight of what we lost. And that's what this Mizmor is begging us not to do. I do just want to refer to Yirmiyahu 29. It's a very important perek. We actually learn a lot of halachot from it. But Yirmiyahu writes a letter to the people in Bavel. And he asks them to do the following thing. So said Adonai to everybody who's out there. Benu batim, build houses. Vashevu, and dwell in them. Nit'u ganot, plant vineyards, ve'ichlu et piryan, and eat their fruits. Kechu nashim, marry, ve'holidu banim, and have children, and have grandchildren. Ve'ravu, and multiply there. Ve'dirshu et shalom ha'ir asher higleiti etechem shama. And yes, even pray for the welfare of Babylonia. You have to do those things. Why? Because it'll be another 70 years before you come back to this place. At the end of the day, Galut requires that we live. We can't cry on the rivers of Babylon forever. We can't. We have to live. And in living, we have to rebuild, and we have to plant vineyards, and we have to start businesses, and we have to marry. And we even have to pray for the nation that holds us captive, because at the end of the day, we require them to live in exile. But you must remember that Yerushalayim will come back. And you have to be there. You have to still be a part of Yerushalayim's story in order to come back to Yerushalayim. And that's exactly what he's telling the people to do in this letter. And so I argue that maybe this Mizmor, as the historical record indicates, was indeed written by Yirmiyahu and indeed corroborates his message to the people, which is go. Do what you need to do to survive there, but do not forget. As long as you don't forget, then when the 70 years pass, you will be a part of the return. And as the Nevu'ah tells us, because this was a prophecy of Beit Sheni as well, of the second Bet HaMikdash as well, when those 2,000 years pass from what Edom has done to you, you will be a part of her return story as well. And I need not tell you that we are a part of that return story, that Eretz Yisrael today is thriving because of that line, Im Eshkachech Yerushalayim, because we actually lived 2,000 years to fulfill the promise that we will not forget Jerusalem. And so today our right hand stands mighty because of this Mizmor. And that's my Tish'a BeAb message for you.